I had just buried my father when the gravedigger grabbed my wrist. "Madam, that coffin is empty," he whispered. He shoved a brass key stamped with 17 into my hand. Simultaneously, my stepmother texted, "Come home alone. Sign the papers tonight." The true terror waiting at Unit 17 wasn't just my living father. It was the realization that I was unlocking a brutal family revenge plotted for almost 20 years. My name is Madison Cook. I am 35 years old, and my entire professional life is built on the strict foundation of verification. As the Director of Compliance for Crescent Ridge Title Solutions, my daily routine involves dissecting discrepancies, auditing complex property histories, and ensuring that every single signature on a real estate transfer is completely legitimate. I spot the lies hidden in the fine print. I find the invisible threads of financial fraud and pull them until the whole fabricated sweater unravels. I am paid to be skeptical and entirely devoid of sentimentality when it comes to the truth. But this afternoon, standing under the bleak, iron-gray sky of Bracken Hollow, I was staring at a glaring discrepancy I could not simply audit away. I was looking at my father's coffin. The coastal wind whipped through the old cemetery, carrying the bitter scent of ocean salt, decaying pine needles, and impending rain. It was a closed casket funeral for my father, Daniel Cook. That detail alone had been a jagged pill to swallow. The official explanation provided to the family was blunt and horrific. A severe fall down a steep flight of concrete stairs following a massive heart attack, rendering the facial trauma too extensive for any kind of public viewing. That was exactly what the county coroner wrote. That was what the funeral director repeated with a practiced, sorrowful nod. But as I stood there, watching the polished mahogany box resting ominously above the freshly dug earth, a cold, persistent sensation crept up the back of my neck. Something was fundamentally unnatural about the narrative. My father was a meticulous, deeply careful man, the image of him tumbling blindly out of control, his body shattered so badly that the heavy wooden lid had to be permanently sealed shut, defied everything I knew about him. It felt entirely too convenient. It felt less like a tragic accident, and more like a perfectly constructed wall designed to keep his own daughter from saying a true, verified final goodbye. I stood frozen as the brief graveside service officially concluded. The sparse crowd of attendees, mostly his old county colleagues and a few wealthy neighbors from the coastal town, began to disperse toward their parked luxury cars. I watched my stepmother, Veronica Cook, play the role of the shattered widow with cinematic perfection. She clutched a crumpled white lace handkerchief, her shoulders trembling delicately under a heavy designer black wool coat, accepting quiet condolences with practiced nods and soft weeping. She did not look at me once. She simply glided toward the waiting black town car, leaving me completely alone near the artificial green turf that covered the mounds of displaced, damp earth. The silence of the graveyard grew incredibly heavy, broken only by the rhythmic scraping of a metal shovel against stone nearby. I turned my head to see the cemetery groundskeeper, a man I knew vaguely as Owen Pike. He was a permanent fixture of the Bracken Hollow Cemetery, a man with a deeply weathered face and rough hands perpetually stained with dark soil. He had been standing near a large oak tree during the entire service, watching the mourners with an unblinking, unsettling intensity. Now, he was walking directly toward me. His pace was too fast, too deliberate for a simple offer of condolences. Before I could take a step back, Owen closed the distance between us. His rough, dirt-caked fingers suddenly shot out and clamped tightly around my left wrist. The physical grip was startlingly strong, bordering on genuinely painful. I opened my mouth to shout, to demand he let go immediately, but the defensive words died in my throat the exact moment he leaned in close to my face. "Madam," he rasped. His voice was thick and harsh, grating like dry gravel sliding over sheet metal. "That coffin is empty." All the ambient noise of the coastal cemetery, the howling wind, the distant car engines starting up, the sharp cawing of seagulls instantly vanished from my perception. I stared directly into his bloodshot eyes, my analytical mind racing furiously to process the absolute absurdity of his statement. I tried to violently yank my arm away, assuming the man was deeply intoxicated or suffering from some severe, sudden mental break, but he held fast, his intense gaze piercing right through my rising panic. "Do not go home," he commanded, his tone dropping to an urgent, frantic whisper. With his free right hand, he shoved something cold and jagged into my open palm, forcibly curling my fingers around it. It was a heavy brass key. I looked down at my hand. Etched deeply into the tarnished, scratched metal was the number 17. "Turnmill Storage," Owen said, his eyes darting nervously over my shoulder toward the wrought iron cemetery gates. "Out on Route 17. You have to get there before the sun goes down." At that exact second, the eerie silence between us was shattered by the sharp, sustained vibration of my phone inside my wool coat pocket. I pulled the device out with my trembling free hand. The screen illuminated brightly with a new text message notification from Veronica. I stared at the harsh digital words, my blood running completely cold in my veins. "Come home alone. Bring the estate files. Do not call anyone." I read the 3 short sentences again. It was completely wrong. Veronica was a woman who lived for social pleasantries and flowery language. Even in her most passive-aggressive, controlling moments, her text messages were heavily padded with emojis, fake warmth, and excessive punctuation. This text was drastically different. It was sterile, highly tactical, and aggressively commanding. It read like a strict directive from a stranger. It read exactly like a trap. The juxtaposition of the moment was paralyzing. A dirty gravedigger physically holding my wrist, swearing to me that my father was not in the earth, and a stepmother waiting in a massive, empty mansion, demanding legal estate documents with military precision. I finally wrenched my arm free from Owen's bruising grasp. I took a stumbling step backward, my heart hammering furiously against my ribs. I looked at the strange, dirty man, clutching the brass key so tightly it cut into my skin. I tried to force my logical, compliance director brain to take immediate control of the narrative. This had to be a cruel, elaborate prank. Perhaps someone with a very sick sense of humor had paid this groundskeeper a few $100s to torment a grieving daughter. "You are completely insane," I breathed out, my voice shaking with both anger and fear. "I just watched them lower him into the ground. I signed the death certificates myself. Whoever paid you to do this, tell them it is not funny." Owen did not look offended by my accusation. Instead, a deep, sorrowful understanding washed over his rugged features. He shook his head slowly from side to side. "He knew you would say that," Owen replied quietly, his rough voice entirely devoid of madness. "Your father knew you would not believe it. He told me, 'Madison will not just take your word for it. She audits things for a living. She always needs the physical proof.'" My breath caught painfully in my lungs. Nobody knew my rigid work habits and skeptical nature like that, except my father. Owen reached deep into the inner pocket of his heavy canvas coat. He withdrew a thick, worn manila envelope. The edges were slightly frayed, as if it had been carried around in secret for a very long time. He extended it toward me. My hands shook so violently that I almost dropped the package as I took it from his dirt-stained fingers. I looked down at the front of the envelope. Written boldly across the center in dark blue ink was a single word. My name, Madison. But it was the specific handwriting that caused the solid ground beneath my feet to tilt entirely out of axis. It was a distinctive, slightly right-slanted cursive, with a sharp, aggressive cross on the letter T and a unique looped tail on the letter N. It was absolutely undeniable. It was the exact handwriting of Daniel Cook. This was not a hurried note scribbled in a brief moment of panic. This was a calculated, perfectly prepared document. This proved that whatever was happening had been premeditated. Owen took a slow step back, melting into the dark shadows cast by the large oak tree. "Route 17, he repeated softly before turning his back and walking away, leaving me standing completely alone next to an open grave that I now heavily suspected was nothing but a theatrical, hollow prop. I did not follow Veronica's strict orders. I did not drive back to the sprawling Cook mansion sitting high on the ocean cliffs. Instead, I practically ran to my own car, a black sedan parked on the gravel shoulder just outside the cemetery gates. I threw myself into the driver's seat, slammed the heavy door shut, and immediately hit the central locking button. The sudden, absolute isolation inside the vehicle was suffocating. The air felt thin and unbreathable. I placed the heavy brass key carefully onto the passenger seat. Beside it, I placed the worn manila envelope. For 10 agonizing minutes, I just sat there and stared at them. I was a professional woman who built her entire life on verifiable facts, and right now, the facts were tearing my reality to absolute shreds. Outside the car window, the first heavy drops of autumn rain began to strike the glass windshield. I took a deep, shuddering breath, my trembling fingers grasping the rough edge of the envelope. I tore the paper flap open, the ripping sound unnaturally loud in the quiet, tense cabin. Inside was a single, heavy sheet of expensive ivory paper. I unfolded it, my eyes immediately dropping to the painfully familiar handwriting. I read the very first line, and in that exact instant, the safe, organized life I had known completely ceased to exist. If you are reading this letter, it means I was forced to disappear before they use you to end everything. The rain came down in heavy, blinding sheets, pounding against the windshield of my sedan as I tore down Route 17. I was driving 20 miles over the speed limit, my knuckles bone-white against the leather steering wheel. My mind was a chaotic, exhausting loop of denial and furious, desperate rationalization. The heavy brass key resting on the passenger seat mocked me with every sharp turn of the vehicle. I am a woman of empirical evidence and strict compliance. Dead men do not send cryptic letters. Dead men do not hire weathered groundskeepers to ambush their grieving daughters. I spent the entire 40-minute drive convincing myself I was actively walking into a deranged extortion scheme. Someone had stolen his personal stationery. Someone had meticulously forged his distinct handwriting. It was a statistical and biological impossibility that the man I just buried was currently breathing air. I clung to that rigid logic like a life raft in a hurricane. Turnmill Storage was a desolate stretch of corrugated metal buildings sitting on cracked asphalt, surrounded by a high chain-link fence topped with rusted razor wire. The sky was bruising into a deep, violently dark purple by the time I pulled through the open security gate. The main office was a small, dingy square illuminated by harsh, flickering fluorescent bulbs. I parked the car, grabbed the brass key, and stepped out into the freezing downpour. The bell above the office door chimed weakly as I pushed my way inside. Behind the scuffed laminate counter stood a woman in her early 40s. She had sharp, calculating eyes and wore a faded gray trench coat over a dark turtleneck. She did not look like a minimum-wage storage clerk. She carried the distinct, hardened posture of a seasoned bureaucrat, someone intimately used to navigating hostile archives and digging through heavily redacted documents. I would later learn her name was Nora Bell, a former county land records investigator who had mysteriously vanished from the government payroll 2 years ago. She did not ask for my name. She did not ask for a rental agreement or identification. Nora looked past me, scanning the empty, rain-slicked parking lot through the dirty window. "Your father is waiting," she said, her voice flat and entirely devoid of dramatic inflection. "Go to Unit 17. Move quickly before the overhead cameras catch a clear angle of your face." I opened my mouth to demand answers, to scream that my father was currently 6 feet under damp earth, but my vocal cords completely paralyzed. The absolute, unwavering certainty in her gaze shattered my remaining logical defenses. I turned and practically ran back out into the violent storm. Row C, Row D, Row E. I sprinted past the identical rolling metal doors until I found the right sequence. Unit 17. The brass padlock securing the latch was heavy and freezing cold. My hands shook so violently, I dropped the key onto the wet concrete twice before finally guiding it into the mechanism. The lock clicked open heavily. I grabbed the wet metal handle and threw my entire body weight backward. hauling the heavy corrugated door upward. It shrieked in loud protest, rolling along the rusted, unlubricated tracks. The space inside was not dark, nor was it filled with discarded household furniture and dusty cardboard boxes. It was blindingly bright, lit by high-wattage industrial work lamps hanging from the metal rafters. Standing directly in the center of the concrete floor, fully illuminated by the stark white light, was Daniel Cook, my father. He was alive. The breath left my lungs in a painful, jagged rush. He looked visibly older, his face gaunt and deeply lined, his gray hair wildly unkempt. He wore a simple dark sweater and worn denim jeans, entirely lacking the perfectly tailored wool suits he exclusively favored in life. The absolute shock of his physical presence struck me with the force of a concrete block. A primal, overwhelming urge to collapse into his arms warred violently with an intense, burning desire to strike him across the face. He had let me mourn him. He had let me stand beside a sealed wooden box and weep in front of our entire community. Before I could process the explosion of grief and rage, before I could even manage to scream his name, Daniel lunged forward. He grabbed me by the shoulders, his grip desperate and terrifyingly strong, yanking me out of the rain and into the harsh light of the unit. He reached past me, grabbed the metal door handle, and slammed it down to the ground with a deafening crash, plunging us into a tense, isolated silence. He immediately threw the heavy interior deadbolt. "Do not speak," Daniel ordered, his voice harsh, breathless, and entirely real. "You do not have time to be angry. Madison, the most dangerous thing right now is not my fake death. It is the people waiting for you to walk blindly into their trap." I finally tore my eyes away from his living face and looked at the environment surrounding us. Unit 17 was not a storage unit at all. It was a makeshift, highly organized command center. The corrugated metal walls were entirely covered in massive whiteboards and cork panels. Thick red string connected printed property deeds, aerial topographical maps of the Bracken Hollow Cemetery, heavily redacted bank statements, and blurry surveillance photographs of prominent local politicians and real estate developers. 3 laptop computers sat on a cheap folding plastic table, screens glowing continuously with running server logs and county registry databases. In the corner sat a heavy-duty document scanner and a commercial-grade paper shredder. It was the paranoid war room of a man actively hunting ghosts. "You are a ghost," I whispered, the words tasting bitter and metallic in my mouth. I signed the medical release forms. I arranged the funeral service. "Why would you do this to me?" Daniel stepped back, his eyes hollow and deeply haunted by exhaustion. "Because if I remained legally alive, they would have killed me in the dark. And then they would have immediately come for you," he explained, his tone completely clinical, devoid of any expected paternal warmth. "I did not fake my death to hide from strangers. I did it to force the traitors out of the shadows. When the primary target is eliminated, the scavengers come out to feed. They move faster. They get greedy. They make mistakes. I needed them to think they won, so I could finally see the entire board." He walked over to the folding table and picked up a thick, securely bound legal folder. He held it out to me. "Look at it, with your professional eyes. Look at the architecture of what they built." I slowly took the folder. The cover bore the official, embossed seal of my own company, Crescent Ridge Title Solutions. I flipped the heavy cover open. It was a massive inheritance transfer protocol, meticulously detailing the liquidation and reassignment of his entire estate, along with several high-value coastal properties he had allegedly managed in secret through proxy corporations. My eyes scanned the bottom of the first printed page. There was my father's signature. I stared at the blue ink. It was a flawless, terrifyingly accurate forgery. The aggressive cross on the T, the specific loop tail on the N. To a casual county clerk or a standard legal observer, it was undoubtedly Daniel Cook. But to a seasoned compliance director, to his own flesh and blood, the uniform pressure of the ink was entirely wrong. It lacked the slight, inconsistent tremor he had developed in his right hand over the last 2 years. It was a digitally replicated vector stamp, printed onto the page with high-resolution ink. But that was not the detail that made the blood freeze solid in my veins. Directly below the forged signature of the deceased was a secondary, highly sensitive authorization line. It listed the primary corporate executor, the sole individual legally responsible for approving the swift transfer of these massive, undocumented assets to a series of untraceable offshore holding companies. It listed the specific person who would bear the absolute entirety of the federal criminal liability when the inevitable state audits eventually discovered the massive, staggering fraud. My name was printed clearly on the authorization line. My corporate identification number was listed beside it. My specific digital compliance token log was heavily referenced in the attached addendum. They had structured the entire illegal empire to look exactly as if I was the mastermind orchestrating a massive, systematic theft following my father's tragic demise. I dropped the folder onto the plastic table, my hands trembling uncontrollably as the sheer, suffocating scale of the betrayal closed in tightly around my throat. Daniel watched me, his expression grim and completely broken. He delivered the final, devastating blow, a sentence that echoed off the cold metal walls and buried itself deep into my chest. The person they want to frame for this whole thing is not me. It is you. The metallic echo of my father's warning hung in the stifling air of the storage unit. It is you. I backed away from the plastic folding table, my eyes darting frantically across the chaotic web of red string and pinned documents covering the corrugated walls. The paralyzing shock of his resurrection was rapidly morphing into a suffocating dread. He was not a ghost, but he was pulling me into a graveyard of a different kind. Daniel stepped toward the largest corkboard. He pointed a weathered finger at a dense cluster of property deeds. For over 2 decades, he had served as the chief land auditor for the county. He spent his entire career tracing invisible lines of ownership along the Bracken Hollow coastline. He explained that a sinister pattern had emerged over the last few years, an aggressive real estate acquisition model that preyed entirely on vulnerability. The targets were always the same: elderly residents living completely alone, individuals suffering from severe cognitive decline, or citizens who had just taken their final breath. He tapped a glossy 8x10 photograph pinned near the top of the board. I recognized the man instantly: Hollis Dane. He was a prominent urban developer, a man whose sharply tailored suits and perfectly manicured smile dominated local television screens and philanthropic galas. To the public eye, Hollis was a visionary dedicated to modernizing the decaying coastal infrastructure, but Daniel traced the red string from Hollis's smiling face down to a dozen obscure shell companies. Hollis was quietly swallowing dozens of prime coastal properties, accelerating the transfers through fabricated inheritance claims, legally dubious power of attorney documents, and falsified death notices. The truly horrifying aspect of the operation was the timeline. The fraud did not begin in a corporate boardroom. It began in the morgue and the cemetery. My father pulled a battered, leather-bound notebook from a stack of papers. The edges were stained with dark earth. I recognized it immediately as belonging to Owen Pike, the gravedigger who had intercepted me. The syndicate utilized an underground network of mortuary attendants and cemetery staff to flag deceased property owners minutes after their passing. Before an estranged daughter in a different state even received the tragic phone call, the legal machinery was already in motion. The title of the deceased's home was swiftly shifted into a holding company within 48 hours. Owen was not just a laborer with a shovel. For 15 years, he had been silently documenting the discrepancies. His handwritten ledger contained pages of specific burial plots that were officially registered with the county as occupied, but remained physically empty beneath the grass. Paper burials. He knew a massive fraud was occurring, but confronting a billionaire developer like Hollis Dane alone was an absolute death sentence. Owen had waited in the shadows until he found someone within the county system who was looking for the exact same anomalies. He found my father. Daniel's hand dropped from the board. He walked over to a smaller, isolated cork panel. Pinned to the center was a faded photograph of a woman with bright, intelligent eyes. My mother, Claire Cook. My breath caught sharply in my throat. She had died in a violent car crash when I was 17 years old. The local police department concluded that the brakes on her sedan had catastrophically failed on a steep, winding coastal road. They called it a tragic, unavoidable mechanical failure. I had spent half my life making peace with that hollow explanation. Daniel touched the edge of her photograph, his voice dropping to a raw, painful whisper. He told me that just before her death, Claire had begun tracing the very first iterations of this exact real estate syndicate. She was a title researcher, just like me. One evening, she had stood in our old kitchen, clutching a stack of heavily redacted property transfers, and whispered a sentence that had haunted him for almost 18 years. "They are eating the money of the dead." I stared at him, the walls of the storage unit feeling as though they were physically closing in on me. My mother had not died by chance. She was murdered because she looked too closely at the paperwork. Daniel confessed that after her funeral, all of her physical research files vanished from her home office. Key witnesses she had interviewed suddenly moved out of the state or refused to answer their doors. The entire investigation was ruthlessly buried. Daniel, left entirely alone to raise a grieving teenage daughter, made the agonizing decision to remain silent. He buried his suspicions deep down to ensure I survived to see adulthood. "Then why step into the light now?" I demanded, my voice cracking under the weight of a decade and a half of lies. "Why orchestrate this massive theatrical suicide?" He turned back to the folding table, his expression hardening into cold, absolute fury. He explained that a month ago, he discovered a critical breach. He found undeniable proof that the highly secure internal registry of Crescent Ridge Title Solutions had been compromised. Someone was actively penetrating the system to alter historical land deeds, fast-tracking the fraudulent transfers for Hollis Dane's syndicate. To bypass the intense cybersecurity protocols, the infiltrator needed high-level administrative clearance. They needed the digital fingerprints of an executive who possessed unrestricted access to the archives. Daniel pulled a printed digital log file from the folder and slid it across the table toward me. I looked at the highlighted text. It was my own employee identification number. My unique login credentials were being utilized at 2 o'clock in the morning to permanently rewrite the ownership history of stolen homes. The syndicate was not merely stealing land anymore. They were meticulously constructing a digital trail of evidence that pointed directly to me as the sole architect of the fraud. When the federal investigators eventually dismantled the operation, Hollis Dane would walk away completely clean, and I would spend the rest of my natural life in a federal penitentiary. My mind raced desperately, trying to calculate the logistics. "Who?" I asked, the word barely escaping my lips. To mimic my digital footprint perfectly, they would need my physical security token. They would need to know my exact remote login schedule. They would need intimate, daily access to my private workspace. I looked at my father. I waited for him to name a corrupt coworker, a rogue IT administrator, or a disgruntled former assistant, but Daniel did not look at his corkboard. He did not point to a blurry surveillance photograph. He looked directly into my eyes. The profound, shattering sorrow etched into his features told me the answer before he even spoke the words. "Madison," he said softly, his voice trembling with a rage he was struggling to contain. "Who sleeps in the same bed as you? Who makes your coffee while your laptop is open on the kitchen island? Who has access to your bag every single night?" The air rushed completely out of my lungs. The entire foundation of my adult life violently fractured and collapsed into dust. "Luke Harlan," Daniel stated, naming the man I had married 5 years ago, my husband. The silence in the room became absolute. The rhythmic pounding of the rain against the metal roof faded into nothingness. I was completely unmoored, trapped in a windowless room with a dead man. Realizing the person waiting for me in our beautiful, warm home was the very architect of my destruction. "I refuse to believe it just because you said his name." My voice was a brittle whisper, echoing off the corrugated metal walls of the storage unit. I stared at the man who used to be my father. my chest heaving with a mixture of betrayal and desperate denial. Luke is my husband. We share a bank account. We share a life. I am a compliance director. Dad. I do not convict a man on circumstantial proximity. I need the raw data. I need to see the digital footprints. Daniel nodded slowly, stepping back to let Nora approach the folding table. She did not offer pity. She simply slid a heavy black encrypted laptop across the plastic surface toward me. I bypassed the primary firewall of Crescent Ridge using a ghost server, Nora stated flatly, her fingers flying across the external keyboard. I routed the connection through 3 separate offshore nodes. Their internal security protocols will not see us looking. Give me your credential string. Madison, prove it to yourself. My fingers hovered over the keys. My hands were shaking so violently, I had to curl them into tight fists for a brief moment before typing. I entered my employee identification, my alphanumeric password, and a bypass override code I kept exclusively for extreme emergency corporate audits. The screen flickered, loading the stark white dashboard of the company's internal registry log. I did not search for Hollis Dane or his shell corporations. I searched for myself. I filtered the database query to show every single login event attributed to my specific administrator account over the past 3 weeks. The results populated instantly in a dense, cascading grid of black text. I scanned the timestamp column, my breath catching in my throat. Login authorized, 12:14 in the morning. Login authorized, 1:30 in the morning. Login authorized, 2:45 in the morning. The digital paper trail was undeniable and entirely damning. For 21 consecutive days, my highly secure executive account had been remotely accessing the corporate mainframe in the dead of night. I immediately traced the location Internet Protocol addresses for those specific sessions. A cold, suffocating weight settled in my stomach. They all routed back to the secure local area network installed in my own living room. Those were the exact hours I was fast asleep upstairs, exhausted from funeral preparations, weeping over old photographs, while my husband was supposedly downstairs working late on his financial consulting portfolios. I clicked on the session details for the midnight logins, my professional training completely overriding my emotional collapse. 6 distinct property files had been accessed and aggressively modified under my digital signature. I opened the first file, belonging to an 82-year-old woman named Margaret. 3 days ago, a new medical addendum had been attached to her deed history. The digital note officially flagged her as suffering from severe sudden-onset dementia, legally establishing her as incapacitated. Immediately following that flag, an expedited power of attorney had been authorized, completely overriding her estranged family and transferring control of her estate to a third-party holding firm. I checked the remaining 5 files. I found the exact same terrifying pattern: incapacity flags, rushed authorizations, immediate asset transfers. It was a digital assembly line of theft. My digital signature was stamped in permanent, unalterable server ink on every single fraudulent approval. Suddenly, my phone vibrated violently against the plastic table. The caller identification displayed Luke's name. I stared at the glowing screen as if it were a venomous snake, a wave of profound nausea washing over me. "Answer it," Daniel instructed quietly from the shadows of the room. "Put him on speaker. Listen to the rhythm of his words. Listen to what he does not say." I pressed the green button, my hand trembling as I set the device back down. "Hello? Madison, where are you?" Luke's voice flooded the small room. It sounded breathless, laced with a heavy manufactured panic that I had completely fallen for just a few days ago. "I have been calling you for an hour. You left the cemetery without saying a single word to anyone." "I needed to drive," I lied smoothly, the sheer adrenaline sharpening my tongue. "I needed air." "I understand, sweetheart. I really do," he replied, his tone shifting instantly from worried husband to pragmatic problem solver. "But you need to come home right now. Veronica just brought over a massive box of documents your father kept hidden in his home office. Madison, it is bad. He had massive, undisclosed debts. hundreds of thousands of dollars in leveraged loans against his county pension. I looked up at Daniel. My father stood perfectly still, his face an unreadable mask of cold fury. He shook his head once, a silent, absolute confirmation of the lie. "What kind of debts?" I asked, forcing my voice to tremble with the appropriate amount of grief and confusion. "I am still going through the ledgers," Luke continued rapidly, his words spilling out in a highly rehearsed, driving cadence. "But Veronica is terrified the creditors are going to leak this to the press by tomorrow morning. It will destroy his legacy. Maddie, we have to cooperate internally. We have to handle this quietly. She has a mitigation package prepared, but it requires your physical signature as his primary beneficiary. We need to sign the estate release papers tonight so the bank does not freeze the house." A second vibration buzzed against my palm. I pulled the phone slightly away to check the lock screen. A new text message from Veronica. "Your husband is right. We are about to lose the coastal property. Come home and sign. We must protect your father's name." They were working in perfect, synchronized tandem. The grieving widow and the supportive, financially savvy husband. The narrative was expertly constructed to trigger my protective instincts, using my father's pristine local reputation as a psychological weapon to force my immediate compliance. But Daniel was right. I listened to the rhythm of Luke's words. In a 5-minute conversation following the burial of my only parent, my husband had not once asked if I was emotionally stable. He had not asked if I was pulled over on the side of a dangerous highway in the freezing rain. He had not offered to leave the house to come find me. His entire focus, cleverly disguised as frantic familial concern, was magnetically pulled toward a singular, desperate objective: the ink from my pen on a binding legal document. "I am on my way," I said, my voice dead and completely hollow. I terminated the call before he could say another word. I needed one final piece of evidence to completely sever the emotional tether I still stubbornly held for the man I married. My digital authentication token, a physical encrypted drive required for all high-level overriding approvals at the firm, was strictly kept in a biometric lockbox at the Crescent Ridge corporate office. I never brought it home. To authorize those midnight transfers, he needed physical access to that specific piece of hardware. I grabbed Nora's untraceable phone from the table and dialed the direct line for the night security desk at my corporate building. The line rang twice before a familiar, gravelly voice answered. "Crescent Ridge Security. This is Marcus." "Marcus, it is Madison Cook," I said, keeping my tone casual and authoritative. "I know I am on bereavement leave, but I am doing an off-site audit for a pending file. Can you check the physical access log for my private office suite? Sometime around late Tuesday evening." "Hold on, Miss Cook. Let me pull the physical badge scans," Marcus replied, the sound of heavy keyboard typing echoing over the line. "Right. Tuesday evening, 7:32. Access granted to your secondary suite." "Was it my badge?" I asked, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. "No, ma'am. It was a guest pass override," Marcus explained casually. "Your husband, Mr. Harlan. He came in with a written authorization email from your account. Said you were overwhelmed with the funeral arrangements and he needed to grab some of your personal work files to help you process things from home. He only stayed for about 10 minutes. Thank you, Marcus. Have a good night." I placed the burner phone gently back onto the plastic table. The final, horrifying truth clicked into place with the cold, absolute precision of a steel vault locking shut. Luke had physically entered my office 2 days before the funeral. He had used a fabricated email to bypass corporate security, opened my desk, and cloned the physical encryption token needed to finalize the fraudulent property transfers. He had completely weaponized my grief. While I was sitting in our living room, weeping over floral arrangements and writing a eulogy for a closed casket, the man I loved was walking down the hall to my home office, logging into my terminal, and meticulously framing me for a multi-million-dollar federal crime. He was wrapping a noose around my neck while holding my hand and telling me everything would be fine. I looked at the forged signatures pinned to the corkboard, I looked at the stolen homes of the vulnerable elderly residents. I realized with absolute clarity that I was not standing in the wreckage of a normal, crumbling marriage. I was sharing a bed with a monster who had already built my paper prison and was simply waiting for me to lock myself inside. I picked up my car keys from the table. The jagged metal felt heavy and sharp against my palm. I looked at my father, the residual shock finally burning away, replaced entirely by an icy, crystalline calculation. "I am going home," I told him, my voice completely stripped of fear. "I am going to sign his papers." I did exactly what I promised my husband I would do. I went home to the sprawling cliffside mansion. I walked through the heavy oak doors, accepted the thick stack of inheritance documents from Luke with trembling hands, and played the role of a completely shattered daughter. I blamed a blinding migraine, locked myself inside the guest bedroom, and left my phone plugged into the wall to freeze my digital location. At dawn, I slipped out the service entrance and drove Nora's untraceable sedan 2 towns over. My professional training demanded physical proof, and the remote digital logs were no longer enough. I needed to look the victims in the eye to understand the true architecture of the slaughter. The scent of industrial bleach and overcooked oatmeal permeated the quiet hallway of the Pine View Rehabilitation Center. Sitting in a wheelchair by a foggy window was Dorothy Wren. She was 78 years old, clutching a yellow knitted blanket, and very much alive. I sat beside her, gently laying a copy of her property deed on the small table. According to the county registry, Dorothy had triggered a deceased spouse estate transition. Her husband had passed away 9 years ago. But 2 months prior, when Dorothy suffered a severe stroke and was placed on a ventilator, the syndicate moved. They legally declared her incapacitated, manipulated the old spousal transition laws, and pushed her home into a blind trust. By the time Dorothy relearned how to swallow solid food, a shell company had legally purchased her oceanfront cottage for 20% of its actual market value. "They told me my niece signed the papers to pay for my medical care," Dorothy whispered, her speech slightly slurred but her eyes sharp with absolute clarity and anger. "I do not have a niece." 3 hours later, I sat in a dimly lit diner booth across from a man in his early 30s. His eyes were heavily bloodshot, surrounded by dark circles of profound exhaustion. He was the nephew of a woman who had lived 3 streets down from the Cook estate. He stirred his black coffee mechanically as he recounted the worst week of his life. His aunt had passed away unexpectedly from a severe respiratory infection. Before he even had time to process the sudden grief, the funeral director was aggressively pressuring him to sign a rapid cremation release, citing strict county sanitary regulations. "They handed me a clipboard with 10 different forms," the nephew explained, his voice thick with regret. "I just kept signing where the yellow sticky notes told me to sign. I just wanted to take her ashes home." I slid a highlighted document across the sticky diner table. Buried deep within that stack of routine mortuary releases was a rapid property quitclaim deed. The funeral home and the real estate buyer were not separate entities. They were both fully owned subsidiaries of the exact same parent corporation. His aunt's home was sold, legally transferred, and entirely gutted within 48 hours of her final breath. I brought these stories back to the cold, corrugated metal walls of Unit 17. Daniel and Nora were waiting, joined by Owen Pike. The gravedigger smelled of damp earth and cheap tobacco. He reached into his heavy canvas coat and dropped a thick, grease-stained ledger onto the plastic folding table. This was not a county document. This was his personal insurance policy against the monsters running the town. Owen flipped the thick pages, his calloused finger tracing columns of handwritten dates, burial plot codes, and hearse arrival times. He pointed to a dozen specific entries scattered over the last 4 years. "Plot Section 4, Grave 42, Owen rasped, tapping the paper heavily. "County paid the mortuary in full for a state-assisted burial. The paperwork says a man named Arthur Vance is resting down there. But the earth never moved. No hearse ever drove through my iron gates. I was told by the director to log the plot as occupied and keep my mouth completely shut." They were fabricating dead bodies to match the fabricated property transfers, ensuring the county census and the real estate registry mirrored the exact same dark lie. If an auditor ever checked the cemetery logs, the paperwork would show a full grave. Nora pulled the encrypted laptop closer, her fingers flying across the keys as she cross-referenced the names from Dorothy's blind trust and the nephew's funeral home. The digital threads all tangled into a single, massive knot. 17 Lantern Holdings, Nora announced, pointing to a corporate registration screen. It is a middleman firm, a ghost company registered to a mail drop in Delaware. But if you track the banking routing numbers, the capital flows directly upward into a massive private equity fund. I did not need to ask whose fund it was. Hollis Dane. The smiling, philanthropic developer was funding the entire predatory network. But the true horror hit me when Nora pulled up the vendor payout logs for 17 Lantern Holdings. 3 weeks ago, the ghost company had issued a massive consulting retainer fee. The recipient was the boutique financial advisory firm where my husband worked. I checked my memory of our joint bank records from that exact week. Luke had excitedly told me about a surprise annual bonus. It was exactly $50,000, paid entirely off-cycle. It was not a bonus for his hard work. It was his blood money for selling out my father and framing his own wife. But why these specific houses? I asked, pacing the concrete floor of the storage unit. It is a massive operational risk. Faking deaths, bribing funeral directors, hacking title databases. Why not just buy the land legally through open markets? Daniel stepped toward the large corkboard. He unrolled a sprawling topographical map of the Bracken Hollow coastline. He picked up a thick red marker and began circling the properties we had just investigated. Dorothy's cottage, the aunt's house. A dozen others from Nora's exhaustive data pull. The scattered red circles suddenly connected. They formed a perfect, unbroken line hugging the edge of the deep water harbor. The Harbor Spine Logistics Corridor, Daniel said, his voice grim. It is a massive commercial port project the state has been debating for a decade. The city council will only approve the industrial rezoning if a developer can present a fully contiguous, uninterrupted strip of coastal land. If even one single homeowner holds out, the entire project dies in committee. He tapped the very center of the map. The absolute keystone holding the entire miles-long strip together was a large, jagged piece of cliffside property, the Cook Estate. Hollis Dane needs a continuous line to secure a government contract worth hundreds of millions of dollars, Daniel explained, his eyes locking onto mine. But I refused to sell. So, they decided I needed to die, and my daughter needed to be legally blackmailed into signing the estate away to cover up her own supposed corporate crimes. My father's shoulders slumped, the weight of the revelation physically pressing him down. He reached into his pocket, his hand trembling slightly. There is something else, Madison, something infinitely worse, he confessed, looking down at his worn boots. I knew exactly where to look for this pattern because your mother mapped it out first, 18 years ago. Claire kept a small, blue notebook. She wrote down the names of the original corrupt notaries, the compromised clerks, the early shell companies. It was the blueprint of their very first test run. I stared at him, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. Where is the notebook? I hid it beneath the floorboards of my home office, Daniel replied, his voice thick with overwhelming guilt. When I staged my accident at the stairs, I left it there. I thought it was completely secure. But last night, I accessed the hidden security cameras I left active in the house. Veronica brought those boxes of fake debt ledgers into the study. While Luke was calling you to demand your signature, she pried the floorboard open. The notebook is gone. The air rushed violently out of my lungs. They were not just hunting my father. They were systematically dismantling the only remaining proof of my mother's bravery. They were twisting her memory, using the exact same lethal system that killed her to steal her family's land and bury her only daughter in a federal penitentiary. The crushing grief I felt standing at the cemetery was entirely gone, burned away and replaced by an absolute, freezing resolve. They wanted my digital signature. They wanted me to quietly surrender my legacy. I was going to give them a war they could never audit. The drive back from the rehab center was a silent descent into my own memories. Every interaction I ever had with my stepmother over the last 14 years began to fracture, revealing the calculated rot beneath the polished surface. I remembered how Veronica constantly steered the dinner conversation away from my mother. Whenever Daniel brought up Claire, Veronica would suddenly need to check the oven or refill a wine glass. I remembered her relentless, gentle pushing to sell the cliffside house. She called it too drafty, too isolated, too burdened with old grief. She completely avoided the Bracken Hollow Cemetery, claiming she possessed a severe phobia of burial grounds. It was not a phobia, it was guilt, or perhaps a tactical avoidance of the very ground she was helping to desecrate. Back in the blinding light of Unit 17, Daniel handed me a small digital audio player. He had spent the last 2 months digitizing a shoebox of old microcassettes he found buried in Claire's attic storage. "Listen to this," he instructed, his voice thick with unshed tears. "I found this tape 3 weeks before I fell down the stairs." I pressed the play button. The audio hissed with static, followed by the terrifyingly familiar sound of my mother taking a sharp, trembling breath. It was a recording she had made for herself, a verbal diary entry dated just 4 days before her fatal car crash. "They know I requested the archive boxes," Claire's voice echoed in the metal room, sounding exhausted and deeply terrified. "Daniel thinks I am just overworking myself, but the signatures on these transfer deeds are identical. Even the pressure marks. If anything happens to me, Madison, Daniel, please listen. Do not trust paperwork that arrives too fast. Do not sign anything the county sends without an independent audit." The recording clicked off. I stared at the plastic device in my hand. My mother had known. She had tried to leave a warning, a desperate flare fired into the dark, and we had completely missed it for nearly 2 decades. How did you not see it? I turned to my father, the raw pain mutating into a sudden, blinding anger. "Veronica lived in our house. She slept next to you. How did you let a viper into Claire's bed?" Daniel sat down heavily on a plastic folding chair, burying his face in his weathered hands. His confession was a ragged, pathetic sound. He admitted he had suspected Veronica's intentions for years. He noticed the strange phone calls she took in the garden, the way she hovered whenever he brought home secure county files. But the crushing loneliness following Claire's death had created a massive, blinding void. Veronica had stepped into that void with perfect, calculated warmth. She had played the role of the savior, the woman who glued a shattered man back together. "I was weak," Daniel whispered, refusing to meet my eyes. "I wanted to believe someone could just love us again. By the time I realized her affection was a strategy, we were legally bound, and she was already weaving her roots into your life." Nora leaned against the metal table, crossing her arms. "It was not a coincidence. Madison, while you were interviewing the victims this morning, I ran a deep background check on Veronica's employment history prior to her marriage, 12 years ago. She was not a high society event planner. She was an independent notary public contracted by the county probate court. She handled the exact same circuit of estate transfers that Hollis Dane first targeted. The revelation struck me like a physical blow. Veronica did not accidentally wander into the Cook family. She was a planted operative. Her marriage to my father was a strategic acquisition, a long-term deployment designed to secure the cliffside estate from the inside. My phone vibrated. A text from Luke. He was asking if my migraine had subsided, his words dripping with manufactured concern. I needed to respond, to maintain the illusion that I was the fragile, compliant wife. I typed a brief message saying I was resting at a coffee shop and would be home soon. Then, Luke called. I answered, forcing my breathing to remain perfectly steady. "Maddie, I am so glad you answered," Luke said, his voice dropping into a low, soothing cadence. "I have been talking to Veronica. We are both incredibly worried about the things your father might have told you before he passed. You have to understand, he was not well. His mind was slipping. He had these paranoid delusions about the county, about his old audits. He was obsessed with your mother's accident to the point of madness. You need to separate yourself from his paranoia. We have to handle the estate practically, without getting dragged into his old delusions. Gaslighting. It was textbook psychological manipulation. He was proactively trying to discredit a dead man, ensuring that if I found any of Daniel's investigative notes, I would dismiss them as the ramblings of a sick mind. He wanted me emotionally detached, isolated, and highly dependent on his guidance. I know. Luke, I replied, my voice perfectly hollow. I just need a little more time. I hung up and looked at Nora. Pull up my personal financial portal, not the corporate one, the private trust my mother left for me. Nora obliged, routing the connection through her secure ghost servers. I logged in, my eyes scanning the ledger of the untouchable account I had planned to use for our future children. The balance was entirely wrong. It was depleted by exactly 75%. I clicked on the transaction history. 6 months ago, a massive collateralized loan had been drawn against the trust. The authorizing document was a sweeping, durable power of attorney. I clicked the attached image of the document. There was my signature, completely forged, alongside a notarized stamp. The money had been funneled directly into a high-risk offshore investment portfolio managed exclusively by Luke's consulting firm. He was not just helping Hollis Dane frame me for the property theft. My husband was actively, directly stealing my inheritance. He had bled my mother's legacy dry to fund his own corporate ambitions. The man I had shared a life with did not exist. He was simply a financial parasite wearing a tailored suit. I need to know exactly how they operate together, I told Nora and Daniel, my tone shifting into something cold and unrecognizable. I need to see the handover. That afternoon, I waited in Nora's unmarked sedan across the street from the Bracken Hollow Grand Hotel. According to the compromised calendar on Luke's synchronized laptop, Veronica had a scheduled personal appointment at 3 o'clock. I watched as her black luxury SUV pulled into the subterranean parking garage. I slipped out of the sedan, keeping a massive concrete pillar between us as I followed her down into the dimly lit lower level. She parked in a secluded corner, far away from the security cameras. A sleek silver sedan was already waiting there. The driver's side window rolled down. It was Hollis Dane. I raised my phone, zooming in through the concrete shadows. Veronica approached his vehicle, her posture rigid. She did not smile. She reached into her designer handbag and produced a thick, heavy manila envelope. It was identical in size and shape to the one containing Claire's stolen blue notebook. She handed it to Hollis. In return, Hollis handed her a small, metallic object, a safety deposit key. I captured 5 clear, high-resolution photographs of the exchange. The billionaire developer and the grieving widow, trading stolen evidence for a guaranteed payoff. I walked back up the concrete ramp, the coastal air hitting my face. An hour ago, my primary goal had been mere survival. I wanted to clear my name, expose the forged signatures, and walk away from the wreckage of my life. But looking at the digital photographs on my phone, feeling the absolute violation of my husband's theft and my stepmother's decade-long lie, mere survival was no longer sufficient. I did not just want to escape the trap they built for me. I wanted to lock them inside it. I wanted to systematically strip away every single asset they cherished. I wanted Hollis Dane to watch his empire crumble into federal indictments. I wanted Veronica to lose her carefully curated societal mask and face the cold reality of a prison cell. I wanted Luke to realize that the wife he thought he was casually leading to the slaughterhouse was actually the one holding the blade. They had used the law, the paperwork, and the trust of their family to crush innocent people. I was going to use those exact same weapons to bury them alive. The drive back to the cliffside mansion required complete mental recalibration. I parked my car in the circular driveway. I took 2 full minutes to adjust my rearview mirror, wiping the fierce clarity from my eyes and replacing it with the dull, glassy stare of a completely broken woman. I smeared my mascara just enough to suggest an afternoon spent weeping in isolation. The game of cat and mouse had officially begun, and I was stepping into the cage wearing the perfect disguise of the wounded prey. When I pushed the heavy oak door open, the house was suffocatingly warm. Luke appeared almost instantly from the hallway. He wore a soft cashmere sweater, projecting the image of a gentle, grieving caretaker. He wrapped his arms around me. Every instinct in my body screamed to push him down the staircase, but I forced my muscles to go entirely slack. I leaned my weight against his chest, letting out a ragged, exhausted sigh. "I am so sorry. Luke," I whispered, keeping my voice frail and hollow. "I just could not be around people today. I drove up the coast for 3 hours just trying to breathe." "It is okay, Maddie," he murmured, kissing the top of my head. The physical contact made my skin crawl. "I was just worried sick. Come sit in the study." Veronica made some herbal tea. I allowed him to guide me into my father's old study. Veronica was perched on the edge of the leather sofa. She looked up, her face a mask of perfectly calibrated pity. On the mahogany desk, arranged with surgical precision, were 3 thick stacks of legal documents. "I know it is incredibly difficult, Madison," Luke said, his tone shifting smoothly into his professional register. "But the bank called again at 4 o'clock. We need to secure the estate before the probate courts freeze the assets due to your father's outstanding debts." I highlighted the urgent signature lines. I walked over to the desk, my hands trembling as I picked up the first packet. My compliance training immediately scanned the dense legal jargon. It was not just a simple transfer of the Cook property. Embedded deep within the clauses was a sweeping digital access grant, legally surrendering my corporate administrative rights to a designated third-party liquidator. The second packet was an absolute liability waiver, fully indemnifying the real estate brokers and financial consultants, namely, Luke's firm against any future litigation regarding the estate's liquidation. It was a flawless, legally binding confession of responsibility. I activated the hidden recording app on my smartwatch with a subtle tap of my right index finger. "It is just so much to read," I stammered, letting a tear slide down my cheek. "I cannot process these legal terms right now." Veronica stood up, smoothing her tailored skirt. She walked over and gently placed a hand on my shoulder. "You do not have to read every single word. Darling, Luke has reviewed it all. You just need to trust us. We are doing this to protect you from the creditors. You should not be driving around town alone, getting yourself worked up visiting places like Unit 17. It is not safe." The room went completely still. My heart hammered violently against my ribs, but I kept my gaze fixed on the mahogany desk. I had never mentioned the storage facility to Luke or Veronica. I had never told them about the brass key or Owen the Gravedigger. Her slip of the tongue was a massive, glaring confirmation. They had tracked my vehicle, or they had someone watching the cemetery gates. "Unit 17?" I asked, looking up with perfectly feigned confusion. "What are you talking about? Veronica?" I was parked at the public beach. A flash of genuine panic crossed Veronica's eyes. She recovered instantly, offering a tight, dismissive wave. "Oh, I must have misunderstood. The police officer who called earlier mentioned a storage unit down on Route 17 that your father used to rent. It does not matter. Just focus on the papers." I needed them out of the room for exactly 60 seconds. "I will sign them," I conceded, my voice weak. "But my head is splitting. Let me go upstairs to the master bathroom and get my strong migraine medication. Give me 5 minutes." Luke nodded eagerly, stepping back from the desk. I walked out of the study and climbed the main staircase. As I reached the second-floor landing, I noticed a faint scuff mark on the hardwood floor leading toward the narrow hallway. I followed it. The heavy wooden door to the attic, which we kept permanently locked, was slightly ajar. I pushed it open. The space was completely ransacked. Cardboard boxes were sliced open, old winter coats were thrown onto the dusty floorboards, and my mother's antique cedar trunk had been pried apart. Daniel was right. Veronica had stolen the blue notebook last night, but the frantic destruction of the attic proved a critical point. The notebook they found was incomplete. They were desperately hunting for missing pages, realizing they did not have the entire blueprint of Claire's investigation. They were panicking. I hurried to the bathroom, flushed the toilet to create ambient noise, and quickly descended the stairs. When I reached the ground floor, I heard Luke's phone ring. He stepped into the adjoining dining room to answer it, his voice dropping to a harsh, hushed whisper. Veronica had stepped into the kitchen to pour more hot water. The study was completely empty. I moved with silent, practiced speed. I reached into the hidden lining of my wool coat and pulled out a duplicate legal folder Daniel had meticulously prepared in the storage unit. It looked identical to the liability waiver, but the pages inside were laced with a hidden digital watermark and entirely fabricated bank routing numbers. If Hollis Dane attempted to submit those specific documents to a judge, it would trigger an immediate automated fraud alert within the state's secure integrity database. I swapped the real waiver with Daniel's rigged copy, sliding the original into my coat pocket. Then, I pulled a small, button-sized global positioning tracker from my watch pocket. I stepped over to the leather armchair where Luke had left his expensive Italian briefcase. I quickly unzipped the side compartment and slipped the tiny black disc deep into the lining, sealing it shut, just as his footsteps echoed in the hallway. I was sitting heavily in the desk chair when he walked back in. I picked up the heavy fountain pen. My hand shook violently, a physical manifestation of my supposed emotional collapse. I pressed the nib to the first signature line on the property transfer document. I wrote my first name, Madison, slowly, agonizingly. Then, I stopped. I let the pen slip from my fingers, leaving a dark puddle of ink on the pristine paper. I buried my face in my hands and let out a loud, shuddering sob. "I cannot do it, Luke!" "Not tonight. I am signing away my father's entire life. Please, I just need to sleep. I will finish it tomorrow morning. I promise." Luke stared at the half-signed document, a muscle ticking furiously in his jaw. The frustration radiating off him was palpable, but he knew pushing me any harder right now would break the carefully constructed illusion of the supportive husband. "Okay, Maddie," he said, his voice tight and strained. "Tomorrow morning, we will handle it first thing." I retreated to the guest bedroom and locked the door. I pulled Nora's burner phone from my coat and opened the tracking application. The small red dot representing Luke's briefcase remained stationary in the study for exactly 2 hours. Then, at midnight, it began to move. I called Daniel. He and Nora were already in the sedan. I guided them using the live coordinate feed. The red dot traveled away from the wealthy coastal cliffs, driving deep into the older, decaying section of Bracken Hollow. It finally came to a complete stop at the edge of the woods, directly behind the main cemetery. "He is at the old stone chapel," Daniel reported over the encrypted line, his voice echoing slightly. "The one the county abandoned 10 years ago." I sat in the dark guest room, watching the screen. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Finally, the red dot began moving back toward the mansion. Luke had completed his drop-off. "Go inside," I told my father. "See what they were doing." I listened to the sound of crunching gravel and a heavy wooden door creaking open on Daniel's end. A flashlight beam clicked on, the sound transmitting clearly over the phone. Nora gasped softly in the background. "Madison," Daniel's voice came through the speaker, thick with a mixture of awe and absolute terror. "Luke was meeting with Hollis Dane's head of security. We just found where they were standing. The floorboards are pulled up." "Did they leave something behind?" I asked, gripping the phone tightly. "No. They tore the place apart looking for something," Daniel replied, the sound of rustling paper filling the audio feed. "But they missed a piece. It was jammed between the stone foundation and the rotted wood. It is a single, torn page." "From Claire's notebook?" "Yes," Daniel confirmed, his breathing heavy. "It has one sentence written in red ink. Listen to this. 'If they get the cookhouse, the entire strip is legalized.'" I stared at the dark ceiling of my bedroom. The final puzzle piece had just snapped into place. They did not just want my house to complete a real estate portfolio. My family's specific deed contained a hidden legal contingency that anchored the entire coastline. By keeping me alive just long enough to secure my signature, they were unwittingly giving me the exact weapon I needed to destroy their entire empire. The assault began precisely at 6 in the morning. It did not start with a violent knock on the front door, but with the synchronized, relentless chiming of my phone. I woke up fully clothed on the guest bed, staring at dozens of missed calls from unknown numbers, corporate colleagues, and local reporters. I opened the primary local news application. The headline was massive, dominating the entire screen in stark black text. Local title director investigated an elderly property fraud. Tragic death of former county auditor examined. They did not merely leak a rumor. They deployed a fully weaponized narrative, dropping it directly onto the town like a bomb. The article cited anonymous corporate sources and featured heavily redacted images of internal server logs. They were the exact access logs Luke had fraudulently generated using my stolen digital token. The journalist painted a devastating, highly detailed picture of a greedy, sociopathic daughter exploiting her executive access to steal from vulnerable senior citizens. Even worse, the article heavily implied that Daniel Cook had discovered his own child's horrific crimes right before his convenient, fatal fall down the stairs. I was no longer a grieving widow or a victim of a tragic accident. To the entire town of Bracken Hollow, I was a monster who preyed on the weak and drove her own father to an early grave. My phone vibrated again, displaying a corporate incoming call. It was the head of human resources at Crescent Ridge Title Solutions, I answered, and her voice was pure, unforgiving ice. Effective immediately, I was placed on indefinite administrative leave pending a thorough internal and state-federal investigation. All of my system access privileges, email accounts, and secure building passes had been completely revoked at midnight. I was sternly ordered not to contact any current clients or step foot anywhere near company property. The isolation protocol was flawlessly executed. Luke and Veronica had successfully severed me from my professional armor, leaving me completely naked and defenseless in the public square. I desperately needed Nora. I dialed her encrypted burner phone. It rang 5 agonizing times before she finally answered. Her breathing was ragged, and the background audio echoed with the distinct, chaotic clatter of a courthouse corridor. "I have exactly 1 minute," Nora whispered frantically, the panic evident even through the encryption. "2 county sheriffs just pulled me out of my apartment before dawn. Someone resurrected a dead subpoena from an old, settled land dispute. I investigated 3 years ago. It is a completely fabricated charge, but the judge is holding me in contempt until a formal hearing tomorrow morning. They confiscated my main laptop and my secure drives. I am completely locked down." "They know we are moving against them," I replied, a cold sweat breaking out across my neck. "Do not say anything to them, Nora. Just stay safe." The line went dead with a sharp click. Before I could even process the catastrophic loss of my best digital operative, my secondary burner phone chimed with an encrypted text message from Daniel. "Do not go near the cemetery today." They sent a physical message. I called him immediately, keeping my voice down as I paced the length of the guest bedroom. "What happened to Owen?" "He is physically fine, but they burned his heavy equipment shed to the ground at 2 in the morning, Daniel reported, his voice trembling with a potent mixture of raw rage and heavy guilt. "The local fire inspector is already classifying it as faulty electrical wiring, but Owen found an empty gasoline can casually left on his front porch. They are escalating the board." Madison. "They are not just hiding behind forged paper and corporate lawyers anymore. If they are willing to commit brazen arson to intimidate a simple gravedigger, they will not hesitate to eliminate you physically if you become a legitimate threat. Then we end this today." "We go to the police right now," Daniel argued, the protective father finally breaking through his calculated, tactical facade. "I will walk straight into the central precinct. I will show the chief of police that I'm currently breathing. That immediately shatters their entire narrative about you killing me to cover up a fraud." "No, you cannot do that," I countered fiercely, my mind racing through the complex public relations variables. "Think about the media spin. Dad, if you walk into a police station today, without the original, unaltered property deeds in your hand, Hollis Dane will absolutely own the story. His corporate lawyers will instantly tell the press that a disgraced, mentally unstable father faked his own death in a desperate, deranged attempt to shield his criminal daughter from federal prosecution. They will successfully argue that we conspired together. We will both end up in a federal penitentiary, and Hollis will still get the land. I walked over to the bedroom window, peering through a narrow gap in the heavy silk curtains. A sleek black television news van was already parking at the bottom of our private cliffside driveway. A reporter was setting up a camera on the public sidewalk. The physical siege had begun. I sat down on the floor and opened my personal laptop, utilizing a secure virtual private network Nora had installed days prior. I began scanning the local financial bulletins and municipal press releases. I needed to know the exact timeline we were fighting against. I found the terrifying answer buried in the county commerce portal. The Harbor Spine Logistics Corridor was no longer a distant, pending proposal. Hollis Dane had officially scheduled a massive public signing gala for tomorrow evening at 8 o'clock at the renovated ferry terminal. My blood ran completely cold. The gala was the absolute point of no return. Hollis was inviting the secondary banks, the state commerce officials, and the massive institutional investment funds. Once he legally transferred the stolen residential properties into those giant, shielded corporate portfolios in front of the press, reversing the theft would become virtually impossible. The victims, like Dorothy Wren, would be hopelessly dragged into complex civil litigation that would easily last for 20 years, and I would be permanently buried under a mountain of civil and criminal indictments before the weekend concluded. I had exactly 38 hours before the concrete permanently set over my grave. I was trapped in a house with the two specific people orchestrating my utter demise, stripped of my career, my public reputation, and my only tactical allies. It was the absolute lowest point of the war. The exact moment the exhausted prey is statistically supposed to surrender to the teeth of the trap, but I was entirely done surrendering. I pulled up the hidden tracking application on my burner phone. The small red dot representing the global positioning tracker I planted inside Luke's leather briefcase was currently resting perfectly still in the downstairs study. I needed the missing pages of my mother's blue notebook. Without Claire's original, handwritten blueprint detailing Veronica's early involvement and the foundational corruption of the title network, our entire defense relied purely on my discredited word against a billionaire's pristine public reputation. I opened the synchronized cloud backup folder Nora had established by quietly cloning Luke's phone data a few days ago. I began meticulously cross-referencing his digital calendar entries with the live positioning coordinates from last night. When Luke drove to the abandoned stone chapel behind the cemetery, he met directly with Hollis Dane's head of security. They ripped the floorboards apart searching for the notebook, but Daniel had explicitly confirmed they only found a single, isolated torn page. I stared intently at the glowing screen, my analytical mind slicing through the psychological profile of the man I had slept next to for 5 long years. Luke was fundamentally a coward, but he was a highly calculating, greedy coward. He would never hand over the ultimate piece of leverage to an apex predator like Hollis Dane without secretly keeping an insurance policy for himself. If Hollis ever decided to cut Luke loose from the massive payout, Luke desperately needed the rest of that notebook to guarantee his own survival and financial security. Luke did not destroy the original ledger. He secretly held it back. I looked closely at the tracker's historical path from last night. After leaving the old stone chapel, the red dot did not travel straight back to our cliffside mansion. It made a highly specific, 15-minute detour to a commercial address located on the wealthy east side of the town. I quickly typed the geographical coordinates into a secure search engine. The address belonged to the Bracken Hollow First National Bank. It was a highly secure private financial facility featuring 24-hour automated safety deposit vaults accessible only by physical keys and biometric scans. I instantly recalled the covert photographs I took in the underground hotel parking garage just yesterday. Hollis Dane handing Veronica a small, metallic safety deposit key in exchange for a thick envelope. Veronica had confidently brought that exact key home to the mansion, but Luke, perpetually playing his own selfish angle within the conspiracy, had intercepted the notebook after Veronica tore it out of the floorboards. He took it straight to the bank to secure his own leverage against both his wife and his co-conspirators. I smiled, a cold, entirely humorless expression that felt completely alien on my own face. Luke arrogantly thought he was playing a four-dimensional game of chess, keeping lethal secrets from both me and his powerful partners. He did not realize he had just handed me the precise geographical location of the explosive device I needed to level their entire kingdom to dust. I did not need a team of expensive defense lawyers anymore. I just needed to walk downstairs, look my betrayers in the eye, and figure out exactly how to break into my own husband's secret vault before tomorrow night. My initial theory about the bank vault was logical, but I had briefly forgotten the sheer depth of my husband's arrogance. I sat in the dark guest bedroom, meticulously analyzing the raw satellite data from the tracker I had planted in Luke's briefcase. Yes, he had stopped at the financial institution for 15 minutes, likely securing emergency cash and his passport, but Hollis Dane owned half the board of directors at that bank. Luke would never hide his ultimate insurance policy in a building his employer controlled. I zoomed in on the geographical coordinates from his earlier stop at the abandoned stone chapel. The red dot had not just hovered inside the ruined building, it had remained completely stationary for 20 minutes against the far north wall. I slipped out of the mansion through the service doors an hour before dawn. Driving straight to the old cemetery grounds, Daniel and Owen Pike were already waiting in the freezing mist. I showed Owen the exact coordinate pin on my screen. The weathered gravedigger looked at the ruined north wall of the chapel, a slow, grim understanding dawning on his face. "He did not bury it," Owen rasped, shining his heavy flashlight over the rotting wooden panels. "He hid it in the one place he knew Hollis's private security team had already torn apart and abandoned. Right behind the old parish grave map." Owen wedged a heavy iron crowbar behind the massive, ancient wooden board that displayed the historical layout of the cemetery. With a violent crack, the rusted nails gave way. Hidden deep inside a hollow, dry cavity between the stone foundation and the oak panels, was a thick bundle wrapped in heavy industrial plastic. I pulled it out with trembling hands. I peeled back the plastic layers to reveal a faded blue notebook. We drove back to the blinding fluorescent lights of Unit 17. Nora walked through the rolling metal door at noon, looking exhausted but fiercely defiant. The fabricated contempt charge had completely collapsed the moment she demanded a public arraignment on the record. Forcing the corrupt county sheriff to release her, rather than risk a federal civil rights lawsuit, our team was fully reassembled, and we finally had the weapon we needed. I opened my mother's notebook on the plastic folding table. The pages were filled with Claire's neat, meticulous handwriting. It was an absolute masterpiece of forensic accounting. Drafted nearly 2 decades ago, she had painstakingly mapped the very first iteration of the property theft syndicate. But it was the entry on page 42 that made the air completely vanish from my lungs. My mother had listed the primary corrupt notary public who authorized the first wave of forged death certificates. The name written in blue ink was Veronica Vance. I stared at the page, a profound, sickening horror washing over me. Vance was my stepmother's maiden name. The dates recorded next to her fraudulent authorizations were from 5 years before she ever allegedly bumped into my grieving father at a charity luncheon. "She was never a grieving widow looking for companionship," I whispered, my voice vibrating with a pure, distilled hatred. "She was a sleeper agent. Hollis Dane planted her inside our family to secure the final piece of the coastline." Daniel closed his eyes, the crushing weight of the betrayal physically pressing his shoulders down, but he did not shatter. Instead, a cold, absolute resolve hardened his features. The time for grief was permanently over. "Compile the strike package," I ordered, turning to Nora. For the next 4 hours, the storage unit transformed into a synchronized war room. We were no longer simply trying to clear my name. We were building an inescapable legal guillotine. Nora rapidly digitized the holy trinity of our evidence. First, my internal corporate access logs, securely tracing the fraudulent late-night logins directly to the Internet Protocol address of Luke's personal laptop. Second, Owen's meticulously maintained burial ledger, proving the existence of the paper corpses and the empty graves. Third, the high-resolution scans of Claire's blue notebook, connecting the entire historical conspiracy directly to Veronica and Hollis. Finally, I provided the crystal-clear audio file captured on my smartwatch, featuring Luke and Veronica aggressively coercing me into signing away the estate while confessing they were actively tracking my movements. I sat at the terminal and programmed a blind, automated deadman switch. I set the digital timer for exactly 8:30 in the evening, right in the middle of Hollis Dane's scheduled public signing gala. If I did not manually enter a complex alphanumeric abort code by that exact minute, the massive encrypted package would simultaneously broadcast to the investigative desks of the 5 largest newspapers in the state, the prosecuting attorneys representing the defrauded families, and the director of the State Integrity Bureau. Even if Hollis had me arrested or quietly murdered tonight, his empire would detonate on schedule. But I did not just want to destroy them on paper. I wanted them to look their sins directly in the eye. I utilized a stack of untraceable prepaid cell phones to make a series of highly sensitive calls. I contacted the nephew from the diner. I contacted the legitimate power of attorney for Dorothy Wren. I reached out to 4 other families Nora had identified in the stolen property registries. I invited them to attend the open press signing gala at the renovated ferry terminal. I told them to dress in their Sunday best, to stand quietly in the crowd, and to wait for my signal. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the concrete floor of the storage unit, Daniel began pacing frantically. "I should walk into that terminal with you," my father insisted, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. "I should step out in front of the cameras the moment Hollis takes the podium. It will instantly shatter his credibility." "No," I countered sharply, stepping into his path. "If you reveal yourself too early, Hollis's corporate defense lawyers will instantly spin the narrative. They will tell the press that you are a mentally unstable man who faked his death to help his criminal daughter escape justice. They will muddy the waters. We cannot interrupt them. We have to let Hollis, Luke, and Veronica walk up to that table and physically sign the final transfer documents in front of the state commerce officials. We have to let them commit federal wire fraud and perjury on live television. They have to cross the point of no return. Only then do we close the trap." Daniel stopped pacing. He looked at me, a slow, fiercely proud smile touching his weathered face. He reached deep into the inner pocket of his heavy canvas coat and withdrew a single, crisply folded legal document. He laid it flat on the table. It bore the heavy, embossed gold seal of the State Historical Society. "I have been holding my own final card," Daniel stated quietly. 3 weeks before I staged my accident on the stairs, I quietly filed a conservation easement with the state registry. I legally bound the entire Cook family estate to the historical borders of the Bracken Hollow Cemetery. The land is now permanently designated as a protected environmental and historical buffer zone. I stared at the document, the sheer brilliance of the tactical strike leaving me speechless. Even if Hollis Dane magically survived the impending criminal indictments, even if he successfully bribed the judges and kept the stolen title to our land, he could never legally pour a single ounce of concrete on that dirt. The multi-million-dollar logistics corridor was already dead, killed by a bureaucratic ghost. I left the storage unit as the sun began to set, casting long, bleeding streaks of crimson across the coastal sky. I drove back to the mansion for the final time. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in the master bathroom. I reached into my garment bag and pulled out the exact same high-collared, black wool dress I had worn to my father's empty funeral. I slipped it on. I deliberately applied pale, translucent powder beneath my eyes to accentuate the dark circles of exhaustion. I let my shoulders slump, perfectly adopting the physical posture of a woman who had been completely crushed by the media smear campaign and the impending threat of a federal prison sentence. I looked thoroughly defeated, a broken daughter ready to surrender her legacy just to make the nightmare stop. Luke knocked softly on the bedroom door. "It is time to go. Maddie, the press is waiting at the terminal." "I am coming," I replied, my voice a fragile, trembling whisper. I picked up my purse, feeling the solid weight of the duplicate documents hidden inside. Everyone in that town believed I was walking to my own execution, but as I opened the bedroom door and looked at my smiling, treacherous husband, I knew the absolute truth. I was the executioner, and the guillotine was already falling. The old Bracken Hollow ferry terminal had been transformed from a decaying coastal relic into a glittering cathedral of corporate greed. Hollis Dane had spared absolutely no expense for his ultimate public relations victory. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the exposed steel rafters, casting a warm golden glow over the crowd of state commerce officials, regional banking executives, and local journalists. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated with silver trays of expensive champagne. At the front of the massive hall sat a long mahogany table, perfectly positioned beneath a towering digital projection screen. This was the altar where Hollis intended to legally baptize the Harbor Spine Logistics Corridor, using my forged signatures to legitimize a stolen coastline worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I walked down the center aisle, feeling the blinding flashes of press cameras against my face. I wore the exact same high-collared black wool dress I had worn to my father's empty grave. I kept my shoulders slumped, my gaze fixed firmly on the polished floorboards. To the dozens of reporters whispering behind their hands, I was the disgraced, broken daughter walking to her own professional and social execution. Luke walked close beside me, his hand resting possessively on the small of my back. He leaned in, his breath hot against my ear. "Just breathe, Maddie. 2 signatures, and this entire nightmare is over. We can finally start fresh." Veronica was already seated at the end of the table, wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit, playing the role of the dignified, surviving matriarch to absolute perfection. She offered me a tight, sympathetic smile that did not reach her calculating eyes. I took my seat at the center of the table. A thick leather portfolio was placed directly in front of me, accompanied by a heavy gold fountain pen. Hollis Dane stepped up to the acrylic podium, his charismatic smile radiating absolute confidence. He adjusted the microphone, his deep voice echoing across the silent hall. He spoke elegantly about municipal revitalization, about bringing thousands of jobs to the coastal community, and about the tragic, heavy sacrifices required to build a better future. He gestured solemnly toward our table, thanking the Cook family for our incredible civic generosity in the wake of such devastating personal loss. "And now, before we finalize the transfer of the final anchor property," Hollis announced, turning toward the massive digital screen behind him, "I want to show you the future of Bracken Hollow." The lights in the terminal dimmed. The screen flared to life, displaying a sweeping drone shot of the ocean. The upbeat orchestral music swelled for exactly 3 seconds. Then, the screen violently glitched. The pristine coastal footage fractured into a storm of digital static. The orchestral music cut out, replaced by a sharp, piercing electronic hum. Hollis tapped the microphone, looking annoyed as his technicians scrambled in the dark. But this was not a technical failure. This was Nora, sitting in a dark storage unit 3 miles away, driving a digital dagger straight into the heart of their mainframe. The static cleared, replaced by a stark, high-contrast white background. The massive screen did not show a logistics port. It showed a raw, unfiltered corporate access log. My employee identification number was highlighted in bright red, alongside a timestamp reading 2:45 in the morning. Beside the log was a photograph of Luke's personal laptop, its unique network address circling back to our shared home router. The crowd began to murmur in profound confusion. The screen shifted again. It displayed a complex web of financial wire transfers. It traced $50,000 moving directly from 17 Lantern Holdings into Luke's private consulting account. Then, the slide changed to a split screen. On the left was a death certificate for a woman named Dorothy Wren. On the right was an expedited property deed transferring her home to Hollis Dane's shell company. The heavy double doors at the back of the ferry terminal suddenly slammed open. The echoing boom silenced the entire room. Owen Pike walked down the center aisle. He did not wear a suit. He wore his heavy canvas coat, his boots leaving faint trails of cemetery dirt on the pristine floor. He carried his thick, grease-stained burial ledger in his rough hands. He walked straight past the front row of terrified banking executives and slammed the heavy book down onto the mahogany signing table. Directly behind Owen was a sight that made the air in the room completely evaporate. A young man was pushing a wheelchair down the aisle. Sitting in the chair, clutching a yellow knitted blanket, was Dorothy Wren. She was frail, but her eyes burned with undeniable fury. "That is my house on that screen," Dorothy's raspy voice carried through the shocked silence. "I am not dead, and I never signed a single piece of paper." Total chaos erupted. Journalists began shouting questions, their cameras firing continuously at the screen and the elderly woman in the wheelchair. At the table, the polished masks of my betrayers shattered into a million jagged pieces. Veronica shot out of her chair, her face completely pale. Her survival instincts kicked in instantly, and she turned her absolute panic into a weapon aimed directly at the weakest link. "Luke!" Veronica screamed over the noise, pointing a trembling finger at my husband. "You handled her estate transfers. You swore to us the paperwork was legally cleared. You forged these documents using her terminal." Luke scrambled backward, knocking his heavy wooden chair to the floor. His handsome face was contorted in sheer, unadulterated terror. He threw his hands up, instantly betraying the very people he had sold his soul to protect. "No, you cannot put this entirely on me," Luke shouted frantically, pointing wildly between Veronica and the podium. "Hollis gave the direct orders. He told me to clone Madison's security token. He said Daniel's death was the perfect cover to wipe the entire slate clean. I just pushed the buttons." The recorded confession echoed through the hall, captured live by 50 different news microphones. My husband had just admitted to federal wire fraud and conspiracy in front of the entire state press corps. Hollis Dane gripped the edges of the acrylic podium so tightly his knuckles turned white. His carefully constructed empire was dissolving in real time, but his supreme arrogance refused to let him surrender. "This is completely absurd," Hollis roared into the microphone, attempting to regain control of the narrative. "This is a coordinated smear campaign orchestrated by a deeply disturbed woman. Madison Cook is a criminal desperately trying to frame my company because her own father discovered her fraud. Daniel Cook died knowing his daughter was a thief. He is dead, and this is her hysterical revenge. You are entirely wrong about that, Hollis." The voice cut through the shouting like a physical blade. It did not come from the podium, and it did not come from me. It came from the shadows of the secondary entrance near the stage. The crowd parted as Daniel Cook stepped into the blinding glare of the chandelier lights. He wore his old, tailored gray suit. He looked older, his face lined with the heavy exhaustion of the past month, but he was undeniably, physically present. The former county auditor, the man everyone in the room had mourned and buried just days ago, was standing perfectly upright. A collective, deafening gasp rippled through the terminal. The banking executives shrank back in their seats. The journalists stopped shouting, completely paralyzed by the absolute impossibility of the moment. Hollis Dane stared at my father, his jaw dropping as the final pillar of his reality violently collapsed. I stood up from the signing table. I did not look defeated anymore. I picked up the golden pen, snapped it cleanly in half, and dropped the leaking pieces onto the fraudulent contracts. I reached into my black purse and pulled out the faded blue notebook. I slammed it onto the table directly in front of Veronica. "My mother wrote this almost 20 years ago," I said, my voice ringing out with cold, absolute authority. "She tracked the very first fake death certificates you ever notarized. Veronica Vance, before you ever manipulated your way into my father's bed, you were helping Hollis steal from the dead. We have the original copies. We have the timestamps. We have every single lie you ever signed your name to." Veronica stared at the notebook, her mouth opening and closing silently like a suffocating fish. I turned my gaze to Hollis, delivering the ultimate, fatal blow. "And even if you somehow managed to buy your way out of a federal prison sentence, Your logistics corridor is already dead. 3 weeks ago, my father quietly signed a conservation easement with the Historical Society. The Cook estate is now permanently legally bound to the cemetery borders as a protected environmental buffer. You cannot pour a single drop of concrete on that cliffside. You burned your entire life to the ground for a piece of dirt you can never, ever touch. My smartwatch vibrated against my wrist. The digital timer had just struck 8:30 in the evening. Simultaneously, the cell phones of every single journalist in the room began to chime and buzz furiously. The massive encrypted data package had successfully detonated, flooding the inboxes of the state's largest media outlets with the undeniable, verified proof of the syndicate. Red and blue emergency lights instantly flashed through the massive glass windows of the ferry terminal. The wail of police sirens drowned out the frantic murmurs of the crowd. The heavy main doors were thrown open, and a dozen armed agents wearing tactical jackets emblazoned with the State Integrity Bureau logo flooded into the hall. Hollis Dane stepped back from the podium, frantically looking for a side exit, but two federal agents tackled him against the stage stairs, pressing his face roughly into the polished wood. Veronica stood frozen at the table, instinctively reaching up to smooth her hair as an officer violently snapped cold steel handcuffs around her wrists, shattering her elegant facade forever. Luke collapsed onto his knees in the center aisle, sobbing uncontrollably into his hands, finally realizing he was nothing more than a disposable pawn who had willingly walked into his own slaughter. The revenge was entirely complete. Not a single drop of physical blood had been spilled, but the destruction was absolute. Their stolen assets would be permanently frozen. The disputed homes would be returned to their rightful families. Their immaculate reputations were violently shredded on live television. I had reclaimed my life, my name, and my family's legacy using the exact same weapons they had tried to use to bury me. The absolute truth, verified on paper. The hall began to clear as the suspects were dragged out into the freezing night air. I stood alone near the mahogany table, watching the flashing emergency lights paint the walls in violent colors. Daniel slowly walked over to me, stopping just a few feet away. We stood amidst the absolute wreckage of the conspiracy that had haunted our family for 2 decades. The silence between us was heavy with the weight of everything we had lost and everything we had just taken back. He looked at me, his eyes shining with unshed tears, and took a hesitant step forward, opening his arms. I did not step into his embrace immediately. I held my ground, looking directly into the eyes of the man who had orchestrated his own death. "No more secrets, Dad," I said, my voice quiet but forged from pure steel. "No more hiding in the shadows. No more telling me lies to protect me. I need you to promise me that right now." Daniel lowered his arms. He looked at the fierce, uncompromising woman standing before him, and a look of profound respect settled over his tired features. He gave me a slow, firm nod. "I promise, Madison. No more lies." Only then did I step forward, wrapping my arms tightly around my father. For the first time in nearly 20 years, we were standing together. We were not standing in front of a cold, empty grave, but before a completely open horizon, looking toward a future that no one could ever steal from us again. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Please comment below to let me know where you are tuning in from so we can interact and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to the Violet Revenge Stories channel, like the video, and support us further by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.